That piece of junk doesn't belong in my classroom. Professor Harrison's voice sliced through the morning silence at Whitmore Conservatory. Every head in the advanced music class snapped toward the back row, where 19-year-old Keisha sat frozen, her duct-taped violin case suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Harrison strode over, picked up her case with 2 fingers like it might infect him, and held it high for all 25 students to witness. The silver tape caught the fluorescent lights as he rotated it slowly, deliberately. Class, observe what happens when people mistake enthusiasm for preparation. He dropped the case onto her desk with a loud thud. Custodial supplies are kept in the basement, dear. Perhaps that's more your speed. Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Keisha's hands trembled as she stared at her grandmother's violin case, the same case that held 30 years of church hymns and her only shot at proving them all wrong. Have you ever been dismissed as worthless before anyone saw what you could really do? The marble halls of Whitmore Conservatory echoed with the sound of perfection. Behind every practice room door, scales climbed toward heaven with mechanical precision. Steinway grand pianos worth more than houses sat like altars in soundproof chambers. Oil paintings of dead white composers gazed down from walls that had witnessed a century of musical excellence and carefully maintained exclusivity. Keisha Williams had walked these halls for 3 months now, but they still felt foreign. Her worn sneakers squeaked against floors polished to mirror shine. Students glided past her, carrying violin cases that cost more than her family's monthly rent. Their conversations peppered with words like summer in Vienna and daddy's connections at Lincoln Center. She clutched her grandmother's violin case tighter. The duct tape Rosa had applied 2 years ago was starting to peel at the edges, revealing the original brown leather underneath. Each morning, Keisha ran her fingers over those silver strips before entering the conservatory, whispering the same prayer her grandmother had taught her. Let this music speak louder than their money. 3 hours ago, she'd been elbow-deep in greasy dishwater at Murphy's Diner, scrubbing plates until her knuckles cracked. The smell of bacon grease still clung to her hair despite the quick shower in the conservatory's student facilities. She worked the breakfast shift every day, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., then rushed across town to make her 9 o'clock music theory class. Her scholarship covered tuition, but everything else fell on her shoulders. Books, sheet music, rosin for her bow. The monthly payment on the tiny studio apartment she shared with her younger brother Marcus, who was counting on her success as much as she was. The violin case had been Rosa's most treasured possession. Keisha remembered watching her grandmother polish the worn leather every Sunday morning before church service, treating it with the same reverence other families reserved for family Bibles. Inside rested a 1960 Heinrich Roth violin modest by conservatory standards, but it had sung hymns that moved congregations to tears for 30 years. "This violin knows how to pray, baby girl," Rosa used to whisper as she tuned the strings in their cramped Baltimore row house. "It's got more church services in its wood than most people got in their hearts." Rosa had saved for 8 months to buy that violin from a retiring church musician. $15 a week, hidden in a coffee can behind the flower. When she finally held it for the first time, she cried, not from sadness, but from recognition. The instrument fit her like it had been waiting. Keisha learned to play on YouTube at 3 in the morning, her laptop balanced on her windowsill, grandmother's violin muted with a practice attachment so the neighbors wouldn't complain. While other conservatory students had private lessons and summer camps, she had grainy tutorial videos and Rosa's voice echoing in her memory. "Feel the music before you play it, child. Let it live in your chest first." By age 16, she could play Vivaldi's Four Seasons from memory. By 17, she'd mastered Bach's Partitas. By 18, she was performing Paganini's Caprices in her bedroom, bowing with precision that would make professionals weep if they could see past the duct tape on her case. The calluses on her fingertips told 2 stories. The deep grooves from violin strings spoke of countless hours practicing scales and etudes. But the burns and cuts came from the restaurant work proof of the price she paid for each hour of musical study. Her practice schedule was carved from exhaustion. After her shift at Murphy's and a full day of classes, she claimed whatever practice room stayed unlocked latest. Sometimes she played in stairwells when the official rooms were occupied by students whose parents could afford private practice time. The conservatory's practice rooms intimidated her at first. Steinway uprights that responded to the lightest touch. Acoustics designed by architects who understood how sound should live and breathe. But Rosa's violin had learned to sing in fellowship halls with cracked ceilings and folding chairs. It could make music anywhere. Last month, her work supervisor at Murphy's offered her full-time hours. "Forget that fancy music school," he'd said, grease staining his apron. "You got good hands for real work." The temptation was real. Full-time meant steady money, an apartment without roaches, maybe even violin lessons for Marcus. But Rosa's final words haunted her dreams. "Don't let anyone silence your song, baby girl." This violin's got more music left in it. The conservatory's financial aid office had made their position clear. Academic probation meant losing her scholarship. One failed class, one semester below their standards, and she'd be back to washing dishes permanently. Professor Harrison's advanced music theory wasn't just a requirement. It was her last bridge to the future Rosa had died believing in. She'd researched Harrison before the semester started. 15 years as department chair, connections to every major symphony on the East Coast. Students called him the gatekeeper because his recommendation could launch careers or end them with equal efficiency. But the research hadn't prepared her for his particular brand of cruelty. The way his eyes skipped over scholarship students during discussions. How he praised students for observations that weren't particularly insightful, as long as they came from the right families. The subtle comments about musical pedigree and proper preparation. Keisha had watched him dismiss talented students whose only crime was playing instruments that didn't cost enough. She'd seen promising musicians transfer out after one semester of his systematic discouragement. But she also knew what her grandmother's violin could do when given the chance to speak. As she sat in Harrison's classroom that morning, violin case balanced across her knees like a shield, she felt Rosa's presence in the worn leather beneath her palms. 30 years of Sunday mornings lived in that wood. Hundreds of hymns that had lifted spirits and healed hearts. The prayers of elderly church ladies who'd never heard of Paganini but understood music's power to transform. The mini-stakes were crystal clear. Fail this class, lose the scholarship. Lose the scholarship, lose the only shot at proving that music belonged to everyone, not just those who could afford to package it properly. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Kick ass today, sis." Grandma's watching. Keisha smiled, running her thumb over the duct tape one more time. Let Harrison judge the packaging. Rosa's violin was ready to speak for itself. Dr. Edmund Harrison III commanded respect the moment he entered any room. At 52, his silver hair was perfectly styled, never disturbed by something as common as weather or worry. His suits were hand-tailored, his shoes Italian leather, his watch a Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars. But it was the violin case that truly announced his status. Custom leather with gold clasps, bearing the logo of a European craftsman whose waiting list stretched 5 years. Inside rested his 1721 Stradivarius $3 million of musical history that he carried like a scepter of authority. Harrison had owned that Stradivarius for 12 years, purchased at auction with family money that traced back to railroad fortunes. He spoke of it the way other men spoke of vintage wine or rare art, as proof of sophistication that couldn't be bought quickly or earned easily. The violin chooses its master, he'd tell prospective students during auditions, his fingers caressing the leather case. Inferior instruments produce inferior music. It's simple mathematics. His office walls displayed the evidence of his philosophy. Photographs showed him performing with symphony orchestras, always prominently featuring his Stradivarius. Concert programs from Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall lined custom frames. Letters from famous violinists thanked him for maintaining standards in classical music education. Students learned quickly that Harrison judged them before they played a single note. He'd circle the classroom during the first week, examining instruments with the intensity of a jeweler appraising diamonds. Those with quality violins received encouraging nods. Others faced skeptical frowns that somehow translated into lower grades throughout the semester. His teaching method was theater as much as instruction. When demonstrating proper technique, he'd remove his Stradivarius from its case with ceremonial precision. Each movement was calculated to remind students of the gap between their instruments and his. The way he rosined his bow imported from France naturally became a ritual of superiority. "Observe the resonance," he'd say, drawing his bow across the strings with practiced elegance. 3 centuries of masters have played this instrument. It knows what real music sounds like. Harrison's reputation extended far beyond Whitmore's walls. He served on audition panels for major orchestras, wrote recommendation letters that could launch careers, and maintained connections with conservatories across Europe. Students competed fiercely for his approval, knowing that his endorsement opened doors that remained permanently locked to others. But his true power lay in elimination. Each semester, Harrison systematically identified students he deemed unsuitable for professional music careers. His methods were subtle but effective impossible assignments for those with lesser instruments. Public critiques that destroyed confidence, private conversations with administrators about lowered standards. The scholarship students felt his displeasure most acutely. Harrison viewed them as necessary evils, diversity requirements that diluted the conservatory's prestige. He'd never stated this directly, but his body language spoke volumes. The way he avoided eye contact during their performances, how he positioned himself physically closer to students from musical families. His habit of discussing summer opportunities that coincidentally required financial resources beyond scholarship students' reach. Previous victims whispered stories in practice rooms and coffee shops. Maria Santos, a brilliant cellist from Queens, had transferred after Harrison publicly questioned whether her instrument was adequate for serious study. David Kim, whose violin playing moved audiences to tears, abandoned his music major after a semester of Harrison's systematic discouragement. Harrison wore these departures as badges of honor. "I'm protecting the integrity of classical music," he'd explained to colleagues over faculty dinners. "Not everyone is suited for this level of artistry." It's kinder to redirect them early. His Stradivarius became a weapon in these battles. During student performances, he'd place it prominently on his desk, a silent comparison between their modest instruments and his musical throne. He'd adjust its position for maximum psychological impact, ensuring every student understood the hierarchy. The professor's morning routine never varied. Arrive at 8:30, unlock his office, and spend 15 minutes communing with his violin. He'd tune it methodically, play scales that echoed through the hallway like a territorial claim. Other faculty members had learned to schedule around this ritual Harrison's sacred time with his $3 million companion. His teaching philosophy extended beyond instruments to bloodlines. Harrison believed musical talent was hereditary, passed down through generations of proper breeding. He collected stories about students' families like genealogical trophies, praising those whose grandparents had season tickets to the symphony, while dismissing others as first-generation musicians. The conservatory's administration loved Harrison because he delivered results they could quantify. His students won competitions, earned orchestra positions, and reflected well on Whitmore's reputation. That these achievements came primarily from students whose families could afford superior instruments and private coaching was a detail conveniently overlooked. As Harrison prepared for his 9 o'clock advanced music theory class, he performed his usual instrument inspection. 25 violin cases arranged on desks awaited his judgment. Most met his standards quality instruments carried by serious students. Then his eyes landed on the duct tape. Silver strips wrapped around brown leather, obvious repair work that screamed poverty and desperation. Harrison's lip curled in distaste. Another scholarship student trying to play in a league beyond their means. He had no idea that this particular violin case held 30 years of prayers, countless hours of dedication, and a musical legacy that would soon humble everything he thought he knew about true artistry. Harrison's advanced violin masterclass was sacred ground. 25 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each occupied by a student whose instrument had survived his preliminary judgment. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating violin cases that represented decades of family investment and musical ambition. This was Harrison's theater, and he was always the star. He moved through the circle like a general inspecting troops, pausing at each desk to examine the instruments that would determine his students' worthiness. The ritual had remained unchanged for 15 years, a methodical assessment that separated the serious from the pretenders. Quality violin cases gleamed under his scrutiny. German craftsmanship, French design, Italian heritage, each told a story of families who understood what classical music demanded. Harrison nodded approvingly at familiar brands, his fingers tracing quality leather and polished hardware. Then he reached Keisha's chair. The duct tape caught the light like a neon sign announcing poverty. Harrison stopped mid-stride, his practiced composure cracking as he stared at the silver strips wrapped around faded brown leather. The contrast was jarring. 24 pristine cases surrounding one obvious repair job. "Miss Williams." His voice carried across the room with surgical precision. "Would you mind opening your container for the class?" Every head turned toward Keisha. She felt their stares like heat lamps, burning through her careful composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlatched the worn brass clasp's original hardware that still functioned despite the case's battered appearance. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay her grandmother's Heinrich Roth violin. The wood was warm, honey-colored, aged and played in, with tiny scratches that told stories of 30 years in church services. It wasn't pristine, but it was loved. Harrison leaned closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to theatrical disgust. He gestured broadly, ensuring every student could appreciate his performance. "Class, observe carefully," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is what happens when people confuse sentimental attachment with professional preparation." He reached toward the violin, then pulled his hand back as if it might contaminate him. "The wood appears weathered. The strings look adequate for amateur purposes, I suppose. But this is Whitmore Conservatory, not a community center." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others leaned forward, drawn by the spectacle. Harrison was just getting started. "Tell me, Miss Williams, where did you acquire this instrument?" He pronounced the word like it tasted bitter. "Estate sale? Pawn shop? Perhaps someone's attic?" Keisha's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. "It belonged to my grandmother. She played it in church for 30 years. Harrison's eyebrows rose theatrically. "Church music." He turned to address the class. "Everyone notes the difference between sacred and classical music. Very different standards, very different expectations." He walked to his desk and reverently opened his own violin case. The Stradivarius emerged like a religious artifact, its varnish glowing under the classroom lights. 300 years of perfection, lovingly maintained and astronomically valuable. "This instrument," Harrison said, lifting the Stradivarius with ceremonial care, "has been played by masters for centuries. It understands what sophisticated music requires. The wood has absorbed decades of proper technique, correct intonation, refined interpretation. He cradled the violin like a newborn, ensuring every student appreciated its beauty. Each component was crafted by Antonio Stradivari himself. The spruce top, the maple back, the ebony fingerboard, all selected for optimal resonance and projection." Harrison's eyes found Keisha's. Can your grandmother's church violin produce conservatory-level sound? Can it handle the technical demands of advanced repertoire? Does it even stay in tune under performance pressure? The room fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock. 25 students held their breath, caught between embarrassment for Keisha and fascination with Harrison's cruelty. Perhaps, Harrison continued, placing his Stradivarius back in its case with exaggerated care, you'd like to demonstrate what your violin can accomplish. Show us the musical possibilities of bargain bin instruments. He gestured toward the center of the circle. Please, Miss Williams, share with the class what 30 years of church services have taught your grandmother's violin. Keisha felt the weight of every stare. Some students looked sympathetic, others curious, a few openly skeptical. This was Harrison's trap fail publicly and confirm his prejudices or attempt something ambitious and risk humiliating herself. What would you like me to play, Professor? She asked quietly. Harrison's smile was sharp as a blade. Something within your instrument's capabilities. Perhaps a hymn? Amazing Grace would be appropriate, given the circumstances. The insult landed perfectly. 25 students understood the implication church music for church violins, simple melodies for simple instruments. But Harrison wasn't finished. He walked closer, towering over Keisha's chair. Unless, of course, you believe your grandmother's violin can handle serious classical repertoire. Bach, perhaps? Brahms? Something that requires actual technique? His voice carried a challenge wrapped in mockery. What do you say, Miss Williams? Do you dare attempt real music on that relic? Or shall we move on to students with proper instruments? The gauntlet was thrown. 25 students waited. Harrison's trap was perfect, except he had no idea what was about to crawl out of that duct-taped case and change everything he thought he knew about music. Keisha's mind raced between doubt and defiance. The weight of 25 stares pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Harrison's challenge hung in the air, sharp and cutting, designed to make her retreat into embarrassment and surrender. She looked down at her grandmother's violin, its honey-colored wood worn smooth by decades of loving hands. Rosa's voice echoed in her memory, clear as Sunday morning bells. This violin don't know about money, baby girl. It only knows about heart. Her fingers traced the edge of the case, feeling the familiar texture of aged velvet. How many times had she watched Rosa perform this same ritual? Opening the case with reverence, lifting the violin like it contained pieces of heaven, positioning it under her chin with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what magic was about to happen. The room was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. Harrison stood there smirking, arms crossed, probably already composing the story he'd tell colleagues about another scholarship student who'd finally been put in her proper place. But Keisha remembered something else. Last month, alone in practice room C at 11 p.m., she'd played Paganini's Caprice number, 24 so beautifully that a janitor had stopped in the hallway to listen. The same piece that made professional violinists weep. The musical equivalent of climbing Mount Everest with bare hands. She thought about Marcus, probably sitting in his high school chemistry class right now, telling his friends about his sister, who was going to be a real musician someday. About Rosa, who'd worked double shifts at the hospital laundry to save $15 a week for 8 months to buy this violin. About every early morning at Murphy's Diner, every aching finger, every sacrifice that had led to this moment. Harrison cleared his throat impatiently. Miss Williams? We're waiting. Keisha stood slowly, her grandmother's violin case cradling 30 years of prayers and possibilities. She looked directly at Harrison, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Professor Harrison, I'd like to play Bach's Chaconne in D minor. The reaction was immediate. Audible gasps from several students. Someone whispered, Is she crazy? Another murmured, That's impossible. Harrison's eyebrows shot toward his hairline. The chaconne was legendary 15 minutes of the most technically demanding solo violin music ever written. Professional violinists spent years preparing for it. Some never attempted it at all. "My dear girl," Harrison said, his voice dripping with false concern, "that piece requires years of proper training with proper instruments. Perhaps something more realistic." Keisha lifted her grandmother's violin from its case, feeling the wood's familiar warmth against her palm. She looked at Harrison one final time. "I understand the risk, Professor. But my grandmother always said this violin has more music in it than most people have prayers in their hearts." She positioned the violin under her chin. "I'd like to try." Keisha raised her grandmother's violin to her chin, the worn wood settling against her collarbone like it had found its home. The room held its collective breath. 25 students, 1 professor, and 30 years of church prayers, all suspended in the moment before sound would either vindicate or destroy everything. She closed her eyes, drew her bow across the G-string, and changed the world. The first note of Bach's chaconne emerged from Rosa's violin like a whispered prayer given voice. Pure, haunting, absolutely perfect. The sound filled the classroom with such unexpected beauty that Harrison's smirk froze on his face mid-expression. Complete silence followed. Not the awkward quiet of embarrassment, but the reverent hush of recognition. That single note hung in the air like incense, announcing that something sacred was about to unfold. Every person in the room felt it, the shift from skepticism to wonder, from judgment to awe. 25 expensive violins sat forgotten in their cases. 25 students who had spent years perfecting their technique suddenly understood they were about to receive a masterclass in what music could truly accomplish. Keisha opened her eyes and continued. The chaconne's opening theme began to emerge, those 4 simple notes that Bach had used as the foundation for musical architecture that rivaled cathedrals. Her bow moved with liquid grace, each stroke precise and intentional, drawing sounds from her grandmother's violin that made the expensive instruments surrounding her seem suddenly ordinary. The students leaned forward unconsciously. This wasn't the tentative playing they'd expected from a scholarship kid with a duct-taped case. This was mastery announcing itself with quiet confidence. Sarah Martinez, who owned a $45,000 Guarneri del Gesù, found herself gripping her chair arms so tightly her knuckles turned white. Harrison's expression shifted from amusement to attention. His arms uncrossed slowly as he watched Keisha's left hand dance across the fingerboard with impossible accuracy. Her intonation was flawless, each note perfectly placed, singing with the clarity of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting every interval in the solitude of practice rooms and stairwells. The first variation emerged, and with it came the realization that this girl understood Bach in ways that couldn't be taught. Her interpretation wasn't just technically correct, it was emotionally sophisticated, revealing layers of meaning that most violinists missed, even after years of expensive private instruction. Rosa's violin responded to Keisha's touch like it had been waiting its entire life for this moment. The wood that had absorbed 30 years of hymns now channeled Bach's mathematical perfection, creating sounds that seemed to originate from some divine source rather than mere strings and varnish. Each note carried the weight of congregation prayers, of Sunday mornings when music lifted spirits beyond earthly concerns. As the second variation began, Keisha's body moved with the music. Not the rigid posture Harrison demanded in lessons, but the natural flow of someone who had learned to let music live in her bones before it reached her fingers. Her grandmother's influence was unmistakable. The slight sway, the breathing that matched the musical phrases, the way her eyes half closed when the melody soared toward transcendence. The complexity increased dramatically, and so did the impossibility of what everyone was witnessing. Double stops. 2 notes played simultaneously emerged from Rosa's violin with crystal clarity that defied physics. Harrison blinked hard as if trying to wake from a dream. His students struggled with double stops after years of expensive lessons and professional coaching. This girl made them sound effortless, natural, inevitable. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Sarah under her breath, unconsciously echoing the language of Rose's church. She'd been struggling with this exact passage for 8 months, working with a private teacher who charged $300 per hour. Marcus Brooks, whose father had spent $40,000 on his violin, sat transfixed. His expensive instrument had never produced sounds remotely approaching what was flowing from that duct-taped case. The realization was humbling and revolutionary. Maybe the problem wasn't his violin. Maybe the problem was everything he'd been taught about what mattered in music. Keisha moved into the third variation, where Bach's genius truly revealed itself through intricate counterpoint that demanded absolute technical mastery. Her bow arm flowed like water across desert sand, creating dynamics that painted the music in shades of light and shadow. Soft notes that barely whispered secrets to the back row, powerful strokes that filled the room with golden sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Rose's violin sang every nuance perfectly, as if 3 centuries of musical evolution had been building toward this precise moment. The instrument that Harrison had dismissed as worthless was proving capable of sophistication that his Stradivarius could barely match, not because of superior craftsmanship, but because of the love that had seasoned its wood through decades of faithful service. Harrison found himself taking an involuntary step closer, drawn by something he couldn't deny or explain. This wasn't possible according to everything he'd been taught, everything he'd built his career defending. Church violins didn't produce this quality of sound. Scholarship students didn't possess this level of technical mastery. 15-year-old tutorial videos from YouTube didn't create musicians who could interpret Bach like they'd studied with the composer himself. But the evidence surrounded him, undeniable and devastating to every assumption that had shaped his professional identity. The fourth variation brought cascading scales that would challenge any member of the New York Philharmonic. Keisha's fingers moved so quickly they blurred into impressionistic smears of motion, yet every note remained perfectly articulated, each one landing exactly where Bach's mathematical precision demanded. The melody emerged above the accompaniment like a voice calling from heaven itself, supported by harmonies that seemed to generate themselves from the violin's ancient wood. Students throughout the room began to understand they were witnessing something that would haunt their memories forever. This wasn't just good playing. This was the kind of performance that changed lives, that reminded everyone why they'd fallen in love with music before conservatory politics and expensive instruments had complicated everything. Emma Rodriguez, whose grandmother had also been a church musician, felt tears starting in her eyes. She recognized something in Keisha's playing that went beyond technique, a connection to music's spiritual roots that formal education couldn't teach and money couldn't buy. The music built toward its emotional center, and Keisha seemed to disappear entirely into the sound. Her consciousness merged with Bach's intentions, her breathing synchronized with phrases that had been written 3 centuries before her birth. Her heartbeat matched the underlying pulse that drove the entire structure forward. 30 years of Rose's prayers flowed through her fingers, transforming mathematical precision into pure spiritual expression that transcended every boundary between sacred and secular music. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he watched his entire worldview crumble in real time. In 30 years of teaching at conservatories from Boston to Vienna, he'd never heard a student, any student, regardless of their instrument's pedigree or price tag play, with this combination of technical perfection and emotional depth. The girl he'd dismissed as unworthy was delivering a performance that humbled everything he thought he understood about musical excellence. The fifth variation exploded with virtuosic fireworks that made several students gasp audibly, their surprise echoing off the classroom's acoustic perfect walls. Lightning fast runs up and down the fingerboard, executed with the precision of a master surgeon performing life-saving operations. Rose's violin responded to every impossible demand. its voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing phrase, as if decades of accumulated music were finally being released in one transcendent moment. "How is this even possible?" whispered James Park, whose parents had remortgaged their house to afford his conservatory education and professional-grade instrument. Keisha moved into the contemplative sixth variation, where Bach's genius turned inward toward meditation and introspection. Here, technique serves emotion rather than dominating it. Each note carried weight, meaning, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human experience distilled into pure sound. Rosa's violin sang with a voice that seemed to understand suffering, hope, redemption. All the themes that had filled those 30 years of church services where music served as a bridge between earthly pain and heavenly promise. The room had transformed completely from a classroom into something approaching sacred space. Music, this honest, this pure, this connected to fundamental human experience, demanded reverence from everyone privileged enough to witness it. Harrison felt his chest tightening, not from anxiety, but from the overwhelming recognition that he was experiencing art in its most essential form. Harrison felt something fundamental cracking inside his chest, not just his prejudices about instruments and students, but his entire understanding of what music could accomplish when freed from institutional constraints and social expectations. This girl, with her grandmother's worthless violin, was creating art that transcended every category he'd spent his career defending and enforcing. The seventh variation brought technical challenges that would break most professionals who'd spent decades perfecting their craft. Rapid string crossings that demanded split-second timing, complex rhythms that required mathematical precision, intervals that demanded perfect finger placement and unwavering bow control developed through years of disciplined practice. Keisha navigated every obstacle with the confidence of someone who had conquered these difficulties through sheer determination and countless hours of solitary practice in empty stairwells and borrowed practice rooms. As the music built relentlessly toward its climax, everyone in the room understood they were experiencing something unrepeatable, a convergence of preparation, inspiration, and spiritual connection that might never occur again in their lifetimes. This wasn't just a performance, it was testimony, proving that excellence could emerge from anywhere when passion met preparation, when love transformed limitation into transcendence. The eighth variation soared with melodic lines that seemed to rise directly toward heaven, carrying everyone present beyond the confines of academic analysis into pure emotional experience. Rosa's violin had found its voice completely now, singing with the accumulated power of every prayer, every hymn, every moment of joy and sorrow it had witnessed in 3 decades of faithful service to something larger than individual ambition. Keisha approached the final variations, where Bach demanded everything a violinist could possibly give and then asked for more. Her grandmother's violin rose to meet every challenge, producing sounds that seemed to originate from some source beyond the physical world, beyond the limitations of wood and steel and human capacity. The room held its breath as she prepared for the most demanding passage, a section that required split-second timing, perfect intonation, and bow control that bordered on supernatural. Professional violinists spent years building toward attempts at this music. Keisha paused for just a moment, her bow hovering above the strings like a conductor's baton before a symphony's finale. In that silence, Rosa's voice echoed one final time. "Play it like you're talking to God, baby girl." Keisha smiled and launched into the climactic finale, where 30 years of accumulated prayers exploded into 15 minutes of musical perfection that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The final note of Bach's chaconne hung in the air like a prayer awaiting answer. Keisha lowered her grandmother's violin slowly, her bow arm still trembling from the intensity of 15 minutes that had just rewritten everyone's understanding of what was possible. Silence. Complete, absolute, reverent silence that stretched for what felt like eternity. 25 students sat frozen in their chairs, afraid that even breathing might shatter the spell that had just been cast. Harrison stood motionless, his mouth slightly open, staring at the girl he had mocked as if seeing her for the first time. Then Sarah Martinez began to clap. The sound cracked through the silence like lightning, and suddenly the entire room erupted. Not polite conservatory applause, but thunderous, overwhelming ovation that shook the windows and echoed down the marble hallways. Students leaped to their feet so quickly their chairs scraped against the floor, creating a percussion section for their celebration. "Oh my God!" Emma Rodriguez shouted over the noise, tears streaming down her face. "That was incredible!" "I've never heard anything like that," Marcus Brooks added, his expensive violin forgotten as he applauded until his palms stung. The noise was deafening. Students who had snickered at Keisha's duct-taped case now fought to get closer, their faces shining with genuine awe and respect. James Park, whose parents had sacrificed everything for his musical education, was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Harrison remained frozen in place, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slideshow. The man who had built his reputation on dismissing unsuitable students had just witnessed the most beautiful performance of his 30-year career emerge from everything he claimed couldn't produce real music. Color drained from his cheeks as the full impact hit him. His entire philosophy instruments determine ability. Breeding determines talent. Price tags predict performance had just been obliterated by a 19-year-old girl with a violin her grandmother bought from a church musician. "Professor Harrison?" Sarah called out over the continuing applause. "Have you ever heard the chaconne played like that?" Harrison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The professor who always had answers, who controlled every classroom conversation with iron authority, couldn't form words. His hands, which had caressed his $3 million Stradivarius with such reverence, now hung uselessly at his sides. Keisha carefully placed her grandmother's violin back in its worn case, treating it with the same respect Harrison showed his precious Stradivarius. The duct tape that had seemed so shameful minutes ago now looked like battle scars on a warrior's armor, evidence of love, dedication, and countless hours of faithful service. The applause began to die down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Students gathered around Keisha's chair, abandoning their own expensive instruments to examine the violin that had just humbled everything they thought they knew about music. "How long have you been playing?" Emma asked breathlessly. "Where did you study?" added Marcus. "Can you teach me that bowing technique?" Sarah pleaded. Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. How did you... Where did that violin... The room fell quiet again, all eyes turning between the shattered professor and the girl who had just rewritten the rules of his classroom. Keisha looked up at Harrison with eyes that held no anger, no triumph, only quiet dignity. "My grandmother always said something, Professor Harrison." Her voice was steady, carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "She told me, it's not the violin that makes the music, baby girl. It's the love you put in the strings." She gestured toward her grandmother's violin resting peacefully in its duct-taped case. "This violin has 30 years of church services inside it. Countless prayers. My grandmother's heart. Sunday mornings when music lifts people beyond their troubles." Harrison winced as if her words were physical blows. "And you know what else, Professor?" Keisha continued, her voice gaining strength. "This garage sale violin? It's actually a 1960 Heinrich Roth, worth about $15,000 when properly restored. My grandmother just couldn't afford the restoration work." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Harrison's face went from pale to ashen. "But the music?" Keisha stood slowly, closing her violin case with reverent care. "The music was always there. It just needed someone who believed in it." She looked directly at Harrison, her gaze unflinching but not cruel. "No price tag can buy that, Professor." The power in the room had shifted completely. The man who had wielded authority through intimidation and snobbery now stood diminished, while the girl he had tried to humiliate commanded respect through pure talent and quiet grace. The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. Students who had barely acknowledged Keisha's existence 15 minutes earlier now surrounded her like she was a visiting master artist. The social hierarchy that had defined Harrison's classroom for 15 years crumbled in the wake of Rosa's violin. "Keisha, that was absolutely incredible," Sarah Martinez said, her voice still shaky with emotion. "I've been working on the chaconne for 2 years with a private teacher, and I've never heard it played like that." "How did you learn to phrase it so beautifully?" Emma Rodriguez asked, genuine curiosity replacing any trace of earlier judgment. "The way you made those double stops sing, I didn't know that was possible." Marcus Brooks, whose $40,000 violin suddenly seemed less impressive, shook his head in amazement. "My teacher always tells me the instrument makes the musician, but you just proved that completely wrong." Phone numbers were exchanged with unprecedented enthusiasm. Study group invitations flew across the room. The girl with the duct-taped case was suddenly the most sought-after practice partner at Whitmore Conservatory. Harrison stood apart from the celebration, watching his carefully constructed world reorganize itself around a truth he had spent decades denying. His Stradivarius, sitting in its custom case, no longer seemed like the ultimate symbol of musical superiority. Instead, it looked like an expensive security blanket for someone who had forgotten what music was really about. "Miss Williams." His voice cut through the excited chatter, drawing every eye in the room. Students stepped back, creating a path between professor and student like witnesses to a historical moment. Harrison approached slowly, each step seeming to require enormous effort. When he reached Keisha's chair, he stopped and did something no one had ever seen before. He looked uncertain, vulnerable, profoundly humbled. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual commanding authority. "And I owe your violin one as well." The admission sent ripples of shock through the students. Professor Harrison, who never admitted mistakes, who never showed weakness, was acknowledging that he had been wrong in the most fundamental way possible. "Would you—" He paused, swallowing his pride with visible difficulty. "Would you mind if I examined your violin properly? I believe I was gravely mistaken about its value." Keisha nodded and reopened her case. Harrison knelt beside her chair, a gesture of respect that stunned everyone present. He studied Rosa's violin with professional attention, noting details he had dismissed in his rush to judgment. Under proper examination, the Heinrich Roth markings were clearly visible. The wood quality was obvious to anyone who looked past superficial appearances. The craftsmanship, while modest compared to his Stradivarius, was solid and thoughtful. "This is indeed a quality instrument," Harrison admitted, his voice growing stronger as professional honesty replaced personal prejudice. "Heinrich Roth made excellent violins in the 1960s. With proper restoration, new strings, bridge adjustment, professional cleaning, this could easily be worth $15,000 to $20,000. He looked up at Keisha with something approaching wonder. But more importantly, it's been loved. Played regularly, maintained with care. That's why it responds so beautifully to your touch." Harrison stood slowly, addressing the entire class. "I want everyone to understand what we've witnessed today. Musical excellence doesn't require expensive instruments or prestigious pedigrees. It requires dedication, passion, and respect for the music itself." The professor who had built his reputation on instrument snobbery was publicly dismantling his own philosophy. "Miss Williams," Harrison continued, "I have connections with several violin restoration specialists. I'd like to arrange for your instrument to receive professional attention at no cost to you. It's the least I can do." But the real transformation was happening among the students. The rigid social stratification based on instrument value was dissolving before everyone's eyes. Emma Rodriguez, whose family had struggled to afford her mid-range violin, sat taller in her chair. James Park looked at his expensive instrument with new understanding. It was a tool, not a trophy. "Professor," Sarah Martinez raised her hand tentatively. Could we hear more about how Keisha learned to play like that? I mean, if she's willing to share." All eyes turned to Keisha, who found herself in the unprecedented position of being asked to teach rather than being taught. "My grandmother always said that music has to live in your heart before it can live in your hands," she said simply. "She taught me to listen to what the music wanted to say, not just what the notes demanded." The conversation that followed was unlike any Harrison's classroom had ever experienced. Students shared stories about their musical journeys, their struggles, their moments of breakthrough. The competitive atmosphere that had defined the conservatory began to crack, replaced by something approaching community. As the class period drew to a close, Harrison made one final announcement. "Miss Williams, there are several opportunities I'd like to discuss with you. Summer master classes, competition applications, scholarship augmentations. Your talent deserves every door we can open." The girl who had entered the classroom as an object of mockery was leaving as its most celebrated student. But more than that, she had changed something fundamental about how everyone present understood the relationship between worth and worthiness, between appearance and excellence. That evening, Keisha sat in her small apartment, practicing scales on her grandmother's violin. But now she was preparing for opportunities she had never dared to imagine. The duct tape on her case no longer represented poverty. It represented perseverance. She whispered to Rosa's photograph on her nightstand. "We did it, Grandma." Your prayers finally got heard. 3 months later, Keisha Williams stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall, her grandmother's newly restored violin gleaming under the spotlight. The Heinrich Roth that Professor Harrison had dismissed as worthless now sang with a voice that moved audiences to tears. But the real transformation wasn't in the violin's appearance. It was in the world's willingness to listen beyond the surface. The story of what happened in Harrison's classroom had spread far beyond Whitmore Conservatory. Videos of Keisha's playing went viral, not because of sensationalism, but because her music carried something that couldn't be manufactured or purchased, authenticity that touched hearts across every barrier of race, class, and background. Harrison himself had become an unlikely advocate for change. His letter of recommendation for Keisha's Carnegie Hall debut included a confession that reshaped his teaching philosophy. "I have learned that excellence announces itself through dedication, not decoration. True musical pedigree is earned through practice, not purchased through privilege." In a world obsessed with brands and price tags, Keisha's grandmother had understood something profound. A violin's worth isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in the music it makes and the hearts it touches. Rosa knew that instruments don't create musicians. Musicians create magic from whatever tools they're given, transforming humble wood and metal into vessels for human expression. But perhaps the most important lesson is how often we judge potential by packaging. How many times have you dismissed someone's abilities because their tools didn't look expensive enough? How many Keishas have you overlooked because their violin cases were held together with duct tape? Talent doesn't announce itself with prestigious labels or perfect presentations. It whispers in practice rooms at 3 in the morning, in grandmother's wisdom passed down through generations, in the determination to prove that excellence belongs to everyone willing to work for it. Every person you've underestimated because their tools don't match your expectations might possess gifts that could change your understanding of what's possible. The question isn't whether someone owns a Stradivarius, it's whether you're ready to recognize the music that's been waiting patiently for someone to believe in it. What songs are you missing because you're too busy judging the instruments? If Keisha's story inspired you to look beyond appearances and listen for the talent that truly matters, smash that subscribe button for more incredible stories of hidden potential proving the doubters wrong. Hit the notification bell and share this video if you believe excellence has no price tag, because next week, We're bringing you the homeless man's chess set, made from bottle caps. Then he checked a grandmaster. Subscribe now to discover more amazing people who prove that greatness can emerge from anywhere when passion meets preparation. Your next dose of inspiration is just one click away.